Hey everyone. Tonight, we're checking into a place you definitely wouldn't want to visit, a medieval hospital. So grab your blanket, dim the lights, and get comfortable, because we're about to take a long, slow walk through the world of healing, when healing usually meant you'd just die slower, in slightly more comfort, under the faint smell of vinegar and rotting flesh. This is the dark history of medieval hospitals, where saints were surgeons, rats were roommates, and prayer was more reliable than medicine. So, imagine you're living in Europe sometime around the year 1200. You're not feeling great. Maybe your leg's swollen, or you've got a fever that's lasted all week. The good news is there's a hospital in town. The bad news? It's not the kind of hospital that's going to fix you. It's more like a combination of homeless shelter, monastery, and early grave. Hospitals back then weren't built for curing people. They were built for caring for people, mostly the poor, the dying, and the ones the rest of society wanted out of sight. The word hospital actually comes from the Latin hospice, meaning both guest and host, which sounds sweet until you realize you're basically a guest in God's waiting room. The earliest medieval hospitals were run by monks and nuns who had, at best, a passing acquaintance with medicine. Their training came from prayer, not anatomy textbooks. They genuinely wanted to help, of course, but this was the Middle Ages, when disease was thought to be divine punishment, and leeches were the go-to treatment for almost everything. So, if you showed up with pneumonia, a broken arm, or the plague, your nurse would probably start by asking when you last confessed your sins. Then you'd be washed, if water was available, and assigned a straw mattress in a long communal hall with about 40 other coughing, moaning patients. Privacy was not really a thing. Neither was sterilization. You might get lucky and end up in a hospital run by the Benedictines or Augustinians. They were known for keeping things at least somewhat organized. But still, cleanliness standards were medieval, which is a polite way of saying horrifying. Chamber pots were communal, bandages were reused, and the air was thick with incense, not for the vibe, but to mask the smell of death and infected wounds. Let's float over to France for a second, to the Hôtel Dieu de Paris, founded around the year 600. It's one of the oldest hospitals in Europe, and it's still standing today. But in its early centuries, it was less of a healing center and more of a human warehouse. By the 1500s, there were often 2 or 3 patients sharing a single bed. That's right, if you were admitted, you got half a straw mattress and maybe a stranger's elbow in your ribs. The beds were lined up like dominoes, shoulder to shoulder, filling vast wards lit by guttering candles. Privacy was not really a thing. If you were rich or noble, you'd never end up here. The wealthy had their doctors come to them, usually men in long robes quoting Galen, the ancient Greek physician who was somehow still considered the medical authority over 1,000 years later. If you were poor, the hospital was your only option, and you took what you could get. Food was minimal. Broth, bread, maybe a spoonful of something that had been boiling for a suspiciously long time. The monks in charge often believed that hunger purified the soul, which is a beautiful sentiment unless you're the one starving. The sick were divided by type, not by disease, but by moral category. There were wards for pilgrims, for the elderly, for orphans, for lepers. The mentally ill were sometimes lumped in with the possessed, which made for some interesting nighttime ambiance. You might be trying to sleep while someone 2 beds down is being exorcised. Let's talk about treatment, if we can call it that. The medieval understanding of illness came down to the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Everything from fever to heartbreak was caused by these fluids being out of balance. So the cure was to rebalance them, usually by bleeding, purging, or making you vomit. Physicians would drain your blood with leeches or knives, confident that your excess heat would float away with it. And if that didn't help, they might suggest a laxative made of ground-up herbs, mercury, or occasionally dung. Because why not? If you lived long enough to complain, you might be given something soothing, like wine mixed with crushed pearls, or a poultice of moss and pig fat. And yes, it's as odd as it sounds. Now, not all hospitals were pure misery. Some, especially in Italy, began to incorporate real medical learning. Places like Santa Maria Nua in Florence or Santo Spirito in Rome had trained physicians and even kept records, primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary for the time. They also believed in the importance of fresh air and natural light, though, again, fresh air in a medieval city wasn't exactly refreshing. Still, they were the closest thing to genuine medical institutions Europe had for centuries. Religion, of course, was everywhere. Each ward was centered around an altar, and every patient's bed faced the crucifix, so you could contemplate salvation while dying of dysentery. The hospital wasn't just a place for the body, it was for the soul. You were expected to make peace with God, confess your sins, and prepare to meet your Maker. Doctors were few, and most care came from monks and nuns who had taken vows of poverty. Their job wasn't to cure, it was to comfort and to pray. A lot. Because prayer, in their view, did what medicine couldn't. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, things weren't much better. Barber surgeons roamed the streets offering cheap operations. They'd pull your teeth, lance your boils, and maybe amputate your arm, all in the same afternoon. No anesthesia, of course, just grit your teeth and think holy thoughts. Hospitals occasionally called these men in for the messier work, but only when absolutely necessary. Surgery was considered low status, something closer to butchery than medicine, and in fairness, it often was. Let's not forget the leper houses, or leprosaria. Medieval Europe was obsessed with separating lepers from the rest of society, convinced their disease was both contagious and moral. Lepers were given their own hospitals, often built outside city walls, where they lived in isolation. They had their own priests, their own cemeteries, and sometimes even their own chapels, though they weren't allowed to touch anyone. Once declared a leper, you were considered symbolically dead. Some cities even held mock funerals for them. Which is dark, yes, but also kind of efficient. At least everyone knew where they stood. The medieval hospital was less a place of medicine than a stage for faith, a reminder that illness was part of the grand divine order. Suffering was not something to be eliminated, it was something to be endured, with patience, and ideally with a rosary in hand. So, in a sense, the hospital wasn't failing at its job. It was doing exactly what it was meant to do: keep you spiritually comfortable while you drifted toward eternity. And somehow, in this grim, candlelit chaos, modern medicine began to form. Hospitals preserved ancient knowledge, cared for the unwanted, and slowly, very slowly, became places of learning rather than just waiting. But that's still centuries away. Let's float next into the world of medieval physicians, the men, and sometimes women, who believed they could actually cure you, usually by consulting the stars. Because, of course, if your leg's infected, what you really need is someone to check Mars' position in Capricorn. Welcome back to the candlelit nightmare. We've wandered the halls of medieval hospitals, those noble, drafty temples of suffering, and now it's time to meet the people who thought they could heal you. The medieval physicians, the miracle workers, the readers of stars and bleeders of veins. The men in long robes who charged a fortune to explain your fever in terms of planetary misalignment. So, sit back, get cozy, because tonight we're diving into the world of medieval medicine, a place where the cosmos decided your cough, leeches were your best friends, and the line between science and superstition was about as thin as a monk's dinner. Let's start with this. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't entirely made up. It was just, hopelessly outdated. Most of it was built on the works of two men who had been dead for over 1,000 years, Hippocrates and Galen. They were brilliant for their time, sure, but their theories were being treated like divine scripture long after they should have been retired. Their big idea was that your health depended on balancing 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor represented an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and each had its own temperament. Blood made you cheerful, phlegm made you calm, black bile made you melancholic, and yellow bile made you irritable, or, as they'd say back then, choleric. So, if you were too sad, that meant you had too much black bile. If you were too angry, too much yellow bile. If you were too alive, too energetic, probably too much blood. The solution was to take some of it out. Enter bloodletting, the ultimate medieval crowd pleaser. Doctors would slice open a vein, usually in your arm, and let your blood drip into a bowl. Sometimes they'd use leeches, which they kept in jars and applied like little slimy syringes. The idea was simple. Sickness came from excess, and health came from balance. So, removing blood removed disease. It was beautifully logical if you didn't think about it too hard. Bloodletting could treat everything from headaches to gout to, wait for it, anemia, which, for anyone keeping score, is literally caused by not having enough blood. But sure, go. Ahead, drain some more. The best physicians, of course, didn't actually do the bleeding themselves. That was work for the barber surgeons, the guys who shaved your beard, cut your hair, and then, for good measure, amputated your foot. The red and white barber pole we still see today, that's a leftover symbol from those days. The red stripe for blood, the white for the bandage. A cheerful little relic of public health care. But medieval physicians weren't just basing their work on fluids. They also believed the stars had something to say about your spleen. This was the golden age of medical astrology, the art of diagnosing your illness based on planetary positions. The belief was that the human body was a microcosm of the universe, and whatever the stars were doing up there, your organs were doing down here. Mercury governed your lungs, Venus your kidneys, the moon ruled your brain, which honestly explains a lot about the medical decisions of the time. Before performing any treatment, a proper physician would cast your horoscope. He'd check whether Mars was in opposition to Saturn or whether the moon was waxing. Only then could he decide if it was a good day to cut into your flesh. Because God forbid you schedule your bloodletting on an unlucky constellation. That could really ruin your recovery. There were even zodiac man diagrams, human figures overlaid with star signs. Aries controlled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on. These charts hung in medical schools, hospitals, and probably in the bedrooms of very confused patients. Speaking of medical schools, yes, they existed. By the 12th and 13th centuries, universities in places like Salerno, Bologna, and Montpellier were teaching medicine to the elite. Students studied for years, memorizing the writings of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, the great Persian physician whose canon of medicine was basically the medieval world's medical Bible. Now, whether these students ever saw a real patient is another story. Theoretical learning was prized far above practical work. Actually, touching a sick body was considered a bit beneath the dignity of a scholar. That was for the barbers and midwives. The true doctor preferred parchment to people. He'd stride into a patient's room in his long black robe, carrying a urinal, that is, a glass flask filled with the patient's urine. Then he'd hold it up to the light, squint at it thoughtfully, and pronounce something profound like, "Yes, the choleric humors are ascendant." That's right, uroscopy was a cornerstone of diagnosis. Doctors believed your urine revealed your inner state. They compared its color, smell, and even its taste, which, yes, means exactly what you think it means. Nothing like a mouthful of medieval diagnostics to start the day. Meanwhile, for those without access to university-educated astrologers, there were folk healers, herbalists, and midwives, the real heroes, quietly keeping people alive through common sense and plants. They used herbs like sage, rosemary, and lavender not because they balanced your humors, but because they actually worked. Though, of course, that didn't stop the church from occasionally accusing them of witchcraft. If a woman cured too many people, well, she was obviously in league with the devil. Medicine, you see, was supposed to come from God, not your garden. Still, herbalists passed down centuries of practical knowledge: willow bark for pain, the ancestor of aspirin, garlic for infections, honey for wounds. The ingredients were humble, but the results could be miraculous, at least compared to the doctors bleeding you dry under a star chart. Now, let's talk about surgery, which existed, but was the stuff of nightmares. The educated physicians avoided it, the barber surgeons performed it, and anesthesia, as we know, was still a few centuries away. They used wine, opium, or simply a large friend to hold you down. Disinfectant? None. Instruments? Usually iron knives wiped on a cloth between uses. Amputations were common, especially during wars or after infections spread beyond saving. Cauterization, or burning the wound shut, was the standard follow-up. The smell was reportedly unforgettable. And yet, there were advances. Surgeons began to study anatomy, often secretly. The dissection of human bodies was technically forbidden by the church, but universities sometimes received permission to examine executed criminals. It wasn't much, but it opened the door to real understanding of how the body worked, instead of relying on thousand-year-old guesswork. One name stands out: Guy de Chauliac, a French surgeon in the 14th century who wrote Chirurgia Magna, a massive surgical textbook that became the standard for the next 200 years. He was also one of the few doctors to stay in Avignon during the Black Death and survive. His notes on plague treatment were grim but practical: avoid the sick, purify the air, and pray. Which, honestly, was better advice than most. Speaking of the plague, no discussion of medieval medicine is complete without it. When the Black Death hit Europe in 1347, it wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Medicine, as it existed, had no idea what to do. Doctors blamed corrupted air, planetary misalignment, bad smells, or divine wrath. Actual bacteria wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years. Some wore the famous beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter the miasma, an early attempt at PPE, though not exactly effective. Others fled the cities entirely. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris filled up so fast that patients were laid on straw in the hallways. Cures included flagellation, whipping yourself to earn God's mercy, bloodletting, or simply sitting near fires to drive away the evil vapors. Spoiler, none of it worked, but it did cement the physician's place in medieval life, not as a miracle worker, but as a kind of philosophical companion in the face of death. Medicine wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. Disease was seen as punishment or a test of faith. Saints and relics were called upon for healing. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common treatments. You might be told to travel barefoot to the shrine of Saint Ralph, patron of plague victims, or to sleep beside a saint's tomb in hopes of divine intervention. It sounds strange now, but in a world without antibiotics, hope was the most potent medicine available. Still, a quiet revolution was brewing. In the later Middle Ages, scholars began to notice inconsistencies. They dissected animals, studied plants, observed symptoms. A few even dared to question Galen. The idea that knowledge could come from experience, from observation, not authority, started to take root. This was the early spark of empirical medicine. It would take centuries to catch fire, but it was there, glowing faintly beneath the incense smoke and superstition. In the meantime, the people continued to rely on what they knew: charms, herbs, prayers, and the occasional doctor with a fancy degree and a portable urinal. And so, medieval medicine carried on, half science, half sorcery, fully convinced of its own logic. It was messy, contradictory, and often fatal, but it was also the foundation of everything that came after. Without the monks copying Galen, the herbalists experimenting in secret, and the surgeons risking excommunication for a peek inside the human body, we wouldn't have modern medicine at all. So next time you pop a painkiller or get your temperature checked, maybe say a quiet thank you to the poor souls who paved the way with bloodletting, leeches, and star charts. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages proved, it's that progress doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, painfully, and sometimes while you're holding a jar of your own urine under candlelight. Let's drift now to another corner of the medieval world, the plague wards, where death came faster than healing ever could, and where doctors learned the true meaning of futility. Welcome back, brave traveler of medieval misery. By now, you've survived the hospitals, endured the physicians, and maybe even made peace with the leeches. But now we enter the real abyss, the plague wards. So settle in, breathe slow. Imagine candlelight flickering on stone walls, the air thick with incense, fear, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. Tonight, we're stepping into the pest houses, the places where Europe tried, and mostly failed, to contain death itself. This is where hospitals stopped pretending to heal. They simply tried to organize the dying. It's the mid-14th century. Somewhere in Europe, a merchant ship docks at a port, maybe in Genoa, or Messina, or Marseille. On board, a few dead sailors, some panicked survivors, and a collection of fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would change everything. Within weeks, the plague spreads faster than rumor. Within months, entire towns vanish. Hospitals, those noble halls of holy compassion, are the first to collapse. They fill within days, overflowing with the fevered, the coughing, and the hopeless. Monks who tended the sick one week are corpses the next. Nuns carry away bodies until they fall ill themselves. The wards become silent, except for the sound of flies. At first, no one quite understands what's happening. Doctors blame the usual suspects: bad air, bad stars, bad morals. They argue over whether the disease comes from looking at someone infected or breathing the same wind. In a way, they're not wrong. It is airborne, but their advice isn't exactly practical. One popular theory: avoid thinking sad thoughts because melancholy weakens the spirit. Another: drink wine, avoid bathing, and carry flowers under your nose. Just in case a rose can fend off a pandemic. People hang posies around their necks. City officials light massive bonfires to purify the air. In Paris, the medical faculty declares that the plague was caused by a planetary conjunction between Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which, to be fair, probably did look ominous at the time. Hospitals try to adapt. The Hôtel Dieu de Paris, one of the largest in Europe, quickly turns into a mass hospice. Each bed, meant for one patient, holds 3 or 4. The dying are stacked like cordwood. Priests move from bed to bed, giving last rites as fast as their lips can move. Eventually, there are no more priests. When the corpses pile too high, carts arrive. The dead are tossed in and hauled away to common pits, plague trenches, dug just outside the city walls. Some are buried so hastily that hands and feet stick out of the soil. Hospitals that can't handle the overflow begin to refuse entry altogether. That's when the pest houses appear, crude, temporary shelters built on the outskirts of towns. They're not hospitals in any real sense. They're quarantine zones where the infected are dumped to die away from everyone else. Some are made of wood, some of canvas. All smell of smoke, sweat, and despair. If you were unlucky enough to be sent there, it meant your death warrant was signed. The people staffing these places, the plague attendants, were often criminals, drunks, or the desperately poor. The job was simple: feed the sick, haul the dead, and try not to breathe too deeply. They were paid well, relatively speaking, but most didn't live long enough to spend their earnings. Many would disappear after a few days, taking their wages and their infection with them. And yet, somehow, a few stayed. Some out of faith, others out of stubborn compassion. They washed the bodies, whispered prayers, and held trembling hands when no one else dared. History rarely remembers them, but they were the closest thing to heroes the Middle Ages produced. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate just how visually strange the plague years must have been. Cities emptied out. Bells rang constantly for the dead. People walked the streets in long robes, their faces hidden behind bird-like masks stuffed with herbs. Those plague doctors, as we think of them now, were mostly a 17th century innovation, but the look captures the spirit perfectly. Half medicine, half nightmare. The mask's beak held lavender, mint, or cloves, anything to mask the smell of decay. The glass goggles were meant to protect the eyes from poisonous vapors. The stick they carried was to poke patients from a safe distance, because touching them was out of the question. It didn't work, of course, but it gave an illusion of control, and in times of terror, that was enough. Inside the pest houses, life, if we can call it that, followed a grim rhythm. Patients arrived daily, carried in on carts or staggering under their own weight. Most had the telltale buboes, swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, hot and purple, usually in the groin or armpits. The pain was indescribable. Some burst on their own, others had to be lanced. The smell was unforgettable. Fever came next, then delirium, then death. Some recovered, against all odds. Maybe their immune systems were unusually strong. Maybe they were just lucky. But they were the minority. Most never left. The attendants burned straw constantly to cover the stench. The sound of coughing mixed with muttering prayers. And outside, the city guards watched from a distance, terrified to go near. It wasn't just one plague, of course. The Black Death of the 1340s was only the first. The disease returned in waves, every decade or two, for centuries. By the time of the later outbreaks, cities had learned to respond faster. Quarantine became law. Ships arriving from infected ports were held for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, hence the word quarantine. Whole neighborhoods were sealed off. Flags marked the houses of the infected. In London, a red cross was painted on the door with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." No one was allowed in or out. In Venice, the authorities built the first true isolation hospitals, lazaretti, named after Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. These were islands of exile where plague victims were shipped by boat and left under the care of doctors and monks. The first, Lazaretto Vecchio, opened in 1423 and became a model for Europe. It had dedicated wards, supply rooms, and burial grounds. On paper, it was humane. In practice, it was still hell. But at least it was organized hell. The church, as always, tried to make sense of the chaos. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for sin. Others preached mercy and penance. Flagellants, roving bands of the faithful, wandered from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of ending God's wrath. They were eventually banned, mostly because they kept spreading the disease. Relics and saints became medical tools. People wore charms blessed by priests. Some even drank potions made from ground emeralds or powdered toads. Desperate times, desperate ingredients. And still, hospitals kept functioning, barely. The few that survived the plague years emerged transformed. They had seen the limits of faith and the fragility of life. Some began keeping records of symptoms and outcomes, which was as close as medieval Europe got to clinical research. For the first time, the idea began to spread that maybe, just maybe, disease wasn't purely spiritual. Maybe it had physical causes. Maybe observation mattered. The pest houses, grim as they were, had forced people to look directly at disease and at the failure of their old explanations. By the late 1400s, Europe's hospitals began to change shape. Some were rebuilt with separate wards for different illnesses. Ventilation became a concern, open windows, airflow, light. Not yet germ theory, but something stirring in that direction. In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti opened, designed by architect Filippo Brunelleschi. It was clean, elegant, even beautiful. It took in abandoned infants, cared for the poor, and reflected a new Renaissance belief that helping others was a civic duty, not just a religious one. Elsewhere, hospitals began to employ physicians full-time, actual doctors, not just monks. Anatomy lectures were held in hospital halls. And slowly, the medieval ward, once just a warehouse for the dying, became a place for learning and occasionally surviving. Still, the plague never truly left. It haunted Europe like a bad dream, resurfacing whenever people got too comfortable. The hospitals stayed ready, beds lined, herbs stocked, shovels at the ready. And through it all, the image of the medieval healer endured. The priest, the nurse, the surgeon, the astrologer, all fumbling toward understanding, all working in candlelight, all surrounded by death, but still, somehow, choosing to stay. That, in the end, might be the only real miracle the Middle Ages gave us. Not cures, not cleanliness, but sheer endurance. So, if you find yourself complaining about modern hospitals, the fluorescent lights, the waiting rooms, the cafeteria food, just remember, it could be worse. You could be lying on a straw mattress, 3 to a bed, praying the stars decide you're not due for another round of divine punishment. Progress is slow, but it's real. And somewhere beneath the rubble of plague pits and pest houses, it began, the first fragile idea that maybe humanity could understand its own suffering, not just accept it. Let's drift next into a quieter chapter, the Renaissance of hospitals. The moment when care began to mean something closer to compassion, and healing began to include the living as well as the dying. So, by now, we've wandered through the candlelit halls of medieval hospitals, where healing often looked suspiciously like supervised decay. But here's where it gets truly fascinating, and a little existential. Medieval hospitals weren't really about living, not in the modern sense. They were about dying properly. And dying properly in the Middle Ages was a full-time job. In fact, you might say that if you survived the 14th century long enough to check into a hospital, you weren't a patient. You were a pilgrim on your final layover before eternity. See, medieval hospitals were part church, part charity, part hospice, and 100% convinced that what mattered most wasn't saving your life, but saving your soul. Medicine was nice if it happened, but holiness was better. Let's float for a moment into one of these establishments, maybe the Hôtel Dieu in Paris. It's the 1200s, the Seine smells like a wet animal, and inside the hospital, it's a symphony of coughs, prayers, and occasional livestock noises. Somewhere, a priest is chanting over a patient who's half asleep, half dead, and definitely not getting better. The staff are nuns, monks, or lay brothers. They're trained in virtue, not anatomy. Their main duties? Pray for your soul, wash your sheets, when possible, and maybe bleed you for good measure. But don't mistake them for cruel. They believed, truly, that suffering purified you. So if you were in pain, that wasn't failure. That was progress. The medieval hospital was, essentially, a waiting room for heaven. Now, let's talk about the financing of these holy waiting rooms. Because, of course, nothing says divine compassion like a well-documented ledger. Hospitals were often funded by noble families looking to buy their way out of hell, or at least rent better seats. The logic was simple: donate land, money, or cattle, and your sins were magically reduced. You might have oppressed peasants for decades, but endow a hospital wing, and suddenly you're Saint Generous of tax evasion. This also explains why so many medieval hospitals were named after saints rather than doctors. St. John, St. Mary, St. Anthony, basically anyone who could be bribed with prayer and property. And, of course, the more prestigious the donor, the more holy the hospital claimed to be. Nobles loved having their coats of arms displayed over the door. It wasn't subtle. You might see starving beggars inside, but the marble plaque out front would proudly read, "Founded by His Grace, account de self-promotion for the glory of God and posterity. Covertly. Charity was spiritual PR, and hospitals were the billboards. But while the rich were buying indulgences with stone and gold, the poor were buying salvation with their bodies. Let's take a closer look at who actually filled these hospitals. Spoiler, it wasn't medieval royalty. The rich stayed home, hired private physicians, or at least alchemists who smelled like vinegar, and paid extra to die in peace. The poor, the sick, the mad, the orphaned, and the unwanted, they were the real residents. Hospitals accepted everyone because that was the point. They were shelters, asylums, and sanctuaries, all rolled into one drafty building. Pilgrims on the road to holy sites often stopped there, sometimes just for a bed, sometimes because they couldn't go any further. Many never left. Patients slept packed side by side, men, women, children, even animals at times. Airflow was a distant dream, hygiene even more so. You could catch a new disease just by rolling over. And yet, through it all, the nuns prayed, the candles flickered, and the angels, allegedly, took notes. Medicine? That was optional. Now, let's meet a few of the cures you might have encountered if you were unlucky enough to end up in one of these institutions. First, the ever-popular bloodletting. Feeling weak? Perfect. The doctor would open a vein and let the bad humors escape. You'd feel lighter immediately, mostly because you'd lost half your blood volume. Then there was cupping, leeches, and purging. Doctors believed illness came from imbalance, too much heat, too much moisture, or maybe your stars were just in a bad mood. The solution was to rebalance you, which often meant draining, burning, or otherwise terrorizing your body into submission. For infections, you might get a poultice of herbs, bread, and possibly urine. Don't ask whose. For fevers, you'd be doused in cold water or wrapped in hot blankets, depending on whether your healer felt fiery or watery that day. And for mental illness, prayer, obviously. Sometimes a few chains, just to help the faith work faster. It's not that these methods were malicious. They were sincere, just wrong. Medieval medicine was a strange cocktail of Christian charity and classical philosophy, shaken vigorously by guesswork. The human body was viewed as a mystery best left to God. And if he decided you should die, well, best to die on clean sheets, surrounded by candles, with your confession freshly signed. But amid all this misery, something almost tender flickers through. The medieval hospital wasn't just a place to die. It was a place to belong, however briefly. For many, this was the only kindness they'd ever known. The nuns whispered prayers over their patients. They offered soup, a blanket, and a bit of dignity to people the world had forgotten. And that, in its own strange way, was healing. There's a beautiful irony here. While modern hospitals focus on saving the body, medieval hospitals were quietly caring for the soul. In a world where plague, famine, and childbirth could all kill you by Thursday, that mattered more. So yes, their treatments were primitive. Their sanitation was a nightmare, but their compassion? Weirdly modern. Still, the Church couldn't resist turning compassion into doctrine. By the late Middle Ages, many hospitals had chapels attached, not as an optional feature, but as the main event. If you wanted medicine, you had to pray first. Sometimes entire wards were oriented toward the altar, so patients could literally face salvation as they died. Doctors, when present, worked under the authority of the clergy. Their job wasn't to cure, it was to preserve order, keep people quiet, and ideally prepare them for confession. The hospital thus became an extension of the monastery, structured, hierarchical, and obedient. The abbot or abbess functioned like a head administrator, part CEO, part spiritual manager. Daily routines were regimented: prayers at dawn, breakfast of stale bread, a round of bleeding before lunch, and a final hymn at dusk. In between, there might be the occasional miracle, though most were simply paperwork errors. Let's not forget, hospitals were also economic engines. They owned land, collected tithes, and employed workers. They even charged pilgrims small fees for lodging. In some regions, they became among the largest landholders, second only to the monasteries themselves. And with that wealth came corruption, naturally. There are records of hospital officials embezzling funds meant for the poor, or selling donated grain for profit. Some hired relatives into holy positions that paid well but required minimal piety. One particularly scandalous. An abbot in 13th century England used hunting income to finance his hunting trips because, the soul needs recreation. But again, none of this shocked anyone. It was medieval Europe. Corruption was practically a sacrament. And then came the Black Death. In 1347, Europe's fragile system of charity-based healthcare collapsed like an overused lung. The plague didn't just overwhelm hospitals, it emptied them. Nuns, priests, and patients alike died in their own beds. Hospitals became morgues. The holy wards of healing turned into silent tombs filled with the stench of rot and candle wax. Those who survived did their best. Some burned incense to cleanse the air. Others hung herbs or sprinkled vinegar on doorframes. A few just locked the doors and pretended they'd never heard of medicine. But here's the haunting part. For many medieval people, the hospital remained a place of hope, even during the plague. When your whole village was dying, where else could you go but to the one building that promised God's attention? And sometimes, amid all the death, that faith alone was enough to keep people alive. By the 15th century, things began to change, slowly. Medicine started creeping out from under theology's shadow. Scholars rediscovered classical texts, new anatomical studies emerged, and hospitals began to tentatively resemble something more medical. But the DNA of the medieval hospital, that fusion of holiness, poverty, and mortality, never really disappeared. Even today, you'll notice hospitals often bear saintly names: St. Mary's, St. Joseph's, St. Luke's. That's no coincidence. It's a fossil from an age when every hospital bed was also a prayer mat. In a way, the medieval hospital is still with us, though thankfully the urine poultices are not. So as we dim the lamps on this chapter of medieval history, picture it one more time. A long hall filled with the soft hum of prayers, a few groans, and the flicker of candlelight. Somewhere, a nun wipes a feverish brow with gentle hands. Outside, snow falls silently against the stone walls. The patient sighs, half in pain, half in peace. And though the medicine was useless, the care, somehow, wasn't. Welcome back, night wanderers. By now, you've probably realized that medieval medicine wasn't exactly scientific. It was a curious blend of theology, philosophy, and whatever someone found growing in the monastery garden that week. And yet, somehow, amid all the incense smoke and saintly relics, something like surgery managed to exist. Not the clean, sterile kind with neat incisions and anesthesia, of course. No, medieval surgery was part miracle, part guesswork, and all guts. Literally. Imagine this. You've been wounded in battle, your leg is leaking in several directions, and someone tells you they know a surgeon who can help. You nod hopefully, until you realize that the surgeon is a monk with a steady hand and a very large knife that used to belong to a butcher. Welcome to medieval surgery, where saints and scalpels shared the same job description. Let's start with the basic setup. Surgery in the medieval world was considered low work. Physicians, the educated kind, who quoted Aristotle between coughs, looked down on it. They preferred to diagnose from a safe distance while holding expensive manuscripts. Surgeons, on the other hand, actually touched people, which, in the medieval hierarchy of professions, put them roughly on par with barbers, blacksmiths, and people who cleaned latrines. Hence the term barber surgeon. Yes, your friendly neighborhood haircutter might also be the guy to amputate your gangrenous toe. A quick shave, a snip, and maybe a little limb removal before lunch. Efficient, if nothing else. They even used the same tools for both trades: razors, scalpels, and sharp hooks, the medieval multi-tool. The only difference was what you were cutting. Of course, practically none of this came with anesthesia. The best you could hope for was a bit of alcohol, maybe a prayer, and some assistance strong enough to hold you down. Some hospitals offered a wooden stick to bite, a quaint touch of courtesy before they began sawing. If you screamed too loudly, you might be reminded that suffering brought you closer to God. Pain was not an unfortunate side effect, it was part of the spiritual treatment plan. After all, if Christ could endure the cross, you could endure a little amputation. This was, quite literally, faith-based medicine. But let's be fair, surgery wasn't all blind agony and divine guessing. Some surgeons actually knew what they were doing. Take Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French physician often called the father of medieval surgery. He wrote Chirurgia Magna, a massive textbook that basically said, let's stop killing so many people during operations. He emphasized observation, hygiene, in a loose medieval sense, and proper instruments. He even advised washing wounds with wine, which, while wasteful, was at least mildly antiseptic. Guy himself survived the Black Death, somehow, and continued treating patients afterward. His writing became the surgical Bible of Europe for 2 centuries. Not bad for a man who operated before antibiotics, anesthesia, or reliable soap. Now, let's talk about what they actually did in these surgeries. Broken bones? Set them with splints, bandages, and prayers. Arrow wounds? Pull out the arrow, if possible. But if the head was barbed or deep, they sometimes pushed it through the body instead. Yes, through. Because why remove a weapon delicately when you can just finish the job aggressively? Cataracts? Medieval eye surgery involved pushing the cloudy lens down into the eye with a needle. It worked about as well as it sounds. Amputations were surprisingly common. Battlefield injuries, gangrene, frostbite, all required quick decisions. A clean cut, a heated iron to cauterize, and you were theoretically good to go. Assuming you didn't die of infection or blood loss, you might even live to brag about it. And dentistry? Let's just say if you went to a barber for a haircut and came out missing a tooth, you probably got the combo package. It's tempting to laugh at all this, the leeches, the bleeding, the bone saws, but medieval surgeons were doing their best within the limits of what they knew. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't understand germs. To them, illness was a balance of humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, all sloshing around inside you like badly mixed soup. If you were sick, you were out of balance. The cure was to restore equilibrium, often by removing something, usually blood. This idea wasn't random. It came from ancient Greece, from Hippocrates and Galen. Medieval Europe simply inherited it, polished it with Latin prayers, and called it medicine. But here's where things get weird. Surgery wasn't just tolerated by the church. Sometimes it was seen as miraculous. For example, if a patient survived a major operation, the success was rarely credited to the surgeon. It was credited to God, or more specifically, to a saint. Enter Saints Cosmas and Damian, the patron saints of medicine and surgery. According to legend, they once performed a miraculous leg transplant, replacing a man's diseased limb with that of a recently deceased Ethiopian. It's a charming story if you don't think too hard about the logistics. Their image was painted everywhere, two serene saints holding scalpels and organs like divine interns assisting the Almighty. Surgeons prayed to them before operations, patients prayed to them after, and everyone hoped for a clean cut and a clear conscience. Hospitals themselves leaned heavily on the miraculous. Many had relics on display, bits of saints' bones, shreds of holy robes, sometimes entire skulls, all believed to enhance healing. If your wound didn't improve after treatment, it wasn't necessarily the doctor's fault. Maybe you hadn't prayed enough. Maybe your faith needed adjusting. One hospital in Italy reportedly stored a vial of what it claimed was the Virgin Mary's milk. Visitors believed it had curative powers. Others housed bleeding crucifixes or statues that supposedly healed by touch. Was it science? Not at all. But in a world where the line between divine and mortal medicine was blurry, faith was its own anesthesia. Still, surgery began to carve out a more respectable niche by the late Middle Ages, mostly thanks to war. The Crusades, for instance, were catastrophic for everyone involved, but excellent for medical innovation. With thousands of soldiers getting stabbed, crushed, or otherwise rearranged, surgeons had endless opportunities to practice. They learned how to remove arrows, set bones, and treat burns. They even developed new instruments, forceps, scalpels, clamps, some of which don't look all that different from what's used today. The battlefield, grimly enough, was the best surgical classroom of the era. And back in Europe, these techniques trickled into hospitals, where monks and barbers alike began experimenting with improved procedures. Slowly, painfully, the foundation of modern surgery was being laid, one wound at a time. But for every practical surgeon, there was still the devout believer who thought illness came from demons or divine punishment. The solution? Exorcism. Yes, even hospitals sometimes performed them. If a patient convulsed or babbled, it wasn't epilepsy, it was possession. So priests would sprinkle holy water, chant Latin verses, and sometimes, just to cover all bases, bleed the patient too. It was a spiritual medical 2-for-1 special. Miracles and medicine danced a strange waltz through the centuries. Each tried to lead, but neither could quite let go of the other. And yet, amid all this chaos, the saints, the scalpels, the sanctimony, there were glimpses of humanity. Imagine a dim hospital room. A surgeon washes his hands in wine, not for hygiene, but as a ritual. He murmurs a prayer. A patient lies on a straw mattress, trembling. Candles flicker. Nuns whisper psalms in the background. The surgeon bends over, blade in hand, guided as much by faith as by skill. He makes the cut. The patient gasps. Somewhere, a bell tolls. Outside, snow falls quietly. It's not modern medicine, but it is medieval compassion, clumsy, painful, sincere. They didn't always save lives, but they tried to save meaning. And that, in the end, might be the one cure the Middle Ages truly understood. Welcome back, gentle night wanderers. Tonight, we reach the final chapter of our journey through the dimly lit, incense-heavy corridors of medieval hospitals, a place where healing was as much about the soul as it was about the body. And by the end, we'll have wandered from leeches to saints, from pest houses to makeshift surgical theaters, tracing the strange evolution of medicine in an age when science, superstition, and faith all shared the same bedside. So, dim the lights, take a slow breath. Let your eyelids grow heavy as we drift into the last whispers of the Middle Ages. In earlier centuries, the body was viewed almost like a temple of God, sacred, mysterious, and full of hidden messages. Disease wasn't merely a physiological problem, it was a moral, spiritual, even cosmic one. If you suffered, it was often interpreted as a reflection of sin, imbalance, or divine displeasure. Hospitals mirrored this worldview. They weren't primarily places to cure your leg or your cough. They were places to prepare you for eternity, to clean your soul, to smooth the path to salvation, to help you endure the slow, holy process of dying gracefully. That might sound morbid, and it was, but there was an undeniable dignity in it. The hospital was a space where care meant presence, where touch and attention were forms of prayer, and where suffering was not ignored, but gently accompanied. And yet, somewhere within this spiritual framework, the seeds of modern medicine quietly took root. The late Middle Ages brought a slow shift. Scholars and physicians began to look more closely at the human body itself. They dissected animals, and sometimes the bodies of executed criminals, seeking understanding beyond what Galen or Hippocrates had imagined. Observation began to matter. Evidence, however rudimentary, began to matter. Anatomy was born, not as a clinical discipline yet, but as curiosity. Surgeons and students started mapping the body, learning what bones, muscles, and organs actually did. This was revolutionary, because for centuries, doctors had treated the body as a series of humors, a cosmic puzzle, or a moral barometer. Now, at last, they were looking at flesh, blood, and sinew with their own eyes. This new perspective didn't erase faith or superstition overnight. The church remained deeply involved in healthcare, and saints still sat on hospital altars. Relics were still consulted for cures. But alongside prayer, observation and record-keeping began to matter. Physicians noted symptoms, recorded outcomes, and compared treatments. Slowly, the medieval hospital evolved from a hospice for the dying into a space where people could sometimes be healed. In a way, the soul and the body were learning to coexist. Doctors no longer ignored pain entirely, they began to study it. Surgeons experimented with techniques. Herbalists refined remedies. Hospitals became sites not just of devotion, but of learning. By the 15th century, some hospitals were sophisticated. Florence, Venice, and Paris had large wards with organized beds, ventilation, and even segregated spaces for different illnesses. Staff included not only monks and nuns, but physicians and trained surgeons. Knowledge was being codified, passed on, and slowly accumulated. The Renaissance would soon accelerate this change. Anatomy studies exploded, leading to more accurate understandings of the human body. Hospitals continued to serve the poor and sick, but they also became centers of research and instruction. The line between faith and science began to blur, then separate, then reconnect in ways that would shape modern medicine. And yet, the medieval hospital left more than knowledge. It left a philosophy of care that survives today. The emphasis on compassion, on attending to the sick with patience and attention, the recognition that illness affects not just the body, but the spirit, these were gifts to future generations. Modern medicine often emphasizes efficiency and technology, but the medieval approach reminds us of something else, that the human presence, a hand on a brow, a whispered word of comfort, a quiet companion in suffering, can be as essential as any medicine. Leeches are gone, bleeding is no longer standard, and astrology no longer decides whether a scalpel may touch flesh. But hospitals remain spaces where lives, bodies, and souls intersect. And in that intersection, the medieval vision quietly. As we close our lantern-lit tour of these shadowed halls, let's pause one final time. Picture the candlelight reflecting off stone walls, the faint smell of herbs, the soft murmur of prayers. Imagine the exhausted attendants, the trembling patients, the surgeons holding hands with saints, all of them striving, imperfectly, to bring relief in a world full of pain. It was clumsy. It was often fatal. It was slow and sometimes cruel. And yet, it was also profoundly human. Medieval hospitals were mirrors of their age, places where faith, fear, hope, and curiosity met. They remind us that medicine is not just a science, but a story of people confronting mortality with what little they knew, doing their best to care for one another, and leaving behind lessons that continue to echo today. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, think of those candlelit corridors, those straw-strewn beds, and the quiet, dedicated hands that guided people through pain and into the unknown. Not every patient survived. Not every doctor was right. But in the end, every effort mattered, and every hospital, humble or grand, was a testament to humanity's persistent, clumsy, and surprisingly tender attempt to face death with some measure of grace. And with that, our journey comes to a close. From leeches and bloodletting to saints and surgeons, from pest houses to early anatomy lessons, we've traced the strange, haunting, and oddly beautiful history of medieval hospitals, where healing often meant slow death, but care never truly ended. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be cleaner than a 14th century ward, and your slumber as gentle as a nun's whispered prayer over a patient long ago.